Hi guys, hope you're all well and that you and your family are all staying safe. Now, for obvious reasons, we can't get on the bank at the minute. So what we're going to take a look at today is self-take photography and how to get the most out of your catch pics. Now we're going to go through some of the basics of catch photography, making sure you get the best photos possible. Then we're going to look at some of the equipment that you might need for taking nice catch photos, as well as explaining some of the settings within the camera. We'll start with the basics of a good catch photo. Now the background wants to be nice and uniform. You don't really want any distractions. So unless it's an iconic place such as, say, the Lockwood or Walthamstow Reservoir, where you might want the tower in the background, or somewhere like Lake Bled with the church in the background, ideally you kind of want the background not to take the focus off of the fish. So that leads me on to the next thing. You need to ensure you have no bivvies or rods in the background. This is quite distracting to the eye when you're trying to look at a catch photo and you can see rods leaning on a bivvy in the background, or even a bivvy itself, or sometimes even a lake in the background. It distracts the viewer from that fish. So on that basis, a safe bet is something like trees or bushes or shrubbery in the background. It just creates a nice atmosphere for that photo and your eyes are purely focused on that fish. Whilst on that subject, you might want to find somewhere where the light is nice and consistent. This is especially important during sunny days. When it's cloudy, it's not too much of an issue as the light is pretty consistent in most places. But like I said, when it's sunny, you do want to take a bit more time picking those correct spots. Now we're going to take a look at some of the equipment that you'll need when taking a catch photo. This is aimed more towards those that are using DSLRs. So if you have a DSLR, this is ideal for you. Or if you're looking to invest in one and not quite sure how you're going to take those catch photos, then stay tuned. So obviously you'll have your camera. That's the main thing that you'll need. Coupling up to that camera, you'll have your specified lens. You'll also have your tripod, an intervalometer and an SD card. And we're going to go into those in a little bit more detail now. Now when it comes to DSLR cameras, there are loads on the market, so you don't have to break the bank to get something that will take really nice catch photos. You tend to have two types of DSLRs, full frame cameras and crop sensors. Now full frame, as the name suggests, captures that image or that video in full frame. These tend to be slightly more expensive than crop sensors. And as the name suggests, a crop sensor crops in that image, usually at a ratio of 1.6. Now this may seem slightly confusing, but this is really important when it comes to choosing the correct lens for taking the catch shots. Now on full frame cameras, I would highly recommend using a 50mm lens. However, if you then put that onto a crop sensor camera, if you times 50 by 1.6, you usually get something around 85mm. Which means, in essence, if you use that 50mm lens on a crop sensor camera, you have the equivalent of an 85mm lens, which isn't ideal for catch shots. This is where the 35mm lens is ideal. So as a summary, if you have a full frame DSLR, I would recommend a 50mm lens. If you have a crop sensor DSLR, I would recommend a 35mm lens. But moving on, you're going to need a nice sturdy tripod. Again, you don't need to break the bank when buying a tripod, especially for photography. You just need to make sure it's nice and sturdy and it's not going to be affected too much by the wind. Next on the list is an intervalometer. These can be picked up really cheaply on sites like eBay or Amazon. You're looking between £10 to £15, but they're absolutely key when taking self-takes. What you can do with an intervalometer is set this at intervals, as the name suggests, of say 3 to 5 seconds, plug that into your camera, and every 3 or 5 seconds that will fire off a shot. It's essentially like having someone else behind the camera, pressing that button, taking that shot every so often. Now lastly, and probably most importantly, you need an SD card. There are loads on the market. All I would say is you get what you pay for. Now if you already have a DSLR, this is a bit that's probably going to interest you the most. We're going to talk about the settings. Now there are three main settings when it comes to photography, and these will all affect each other. So if you change one, the likelihood is you'll have to change the other two to compensate. Now, it all sounds slightly confusing. We're going to break this down into a bit more detail. Now, the three settings are ISO, or ISO, aperture, also known as f-stop or depth of field, and lastly, shutter speed. ISO represents how sensitive your camera is to light. So in bright sunny conditions, you want the ISO as low as possible. In most cases, the lowest ISO is around 100. This can be 50 to 200, depends what camera you have. In darker settings, you want to increase your ISO. So this increases your camera's sensitivity to light and in essence allows more light into that camera. Now it's worth noting, when you up the ISO, especially when you get to around the 800 to 1000 mark, the camera will let in a lot more light, but in addition to that, it also creates a lot of noise and grain in your images. Use as little as you can get away with. So on a bright sunny day, like I said, use an ISO of around 100, where if it starts to get into the evening and you're just starting to lose the light, but you don't need the flash yet, maybe bump that ISO up to sort of 400 to 600. So that's a brief look at the ISO. Next we're going to look at the aperture, or the f-stop, or the depth of field, depending what phrase you like to say. Aperture is the size of the opening in the lens that determines how much light hits the sensor. Now aperture is measured in units of f-stop, hence why some people refer to it as the f-stop. So the wider the f-stop that you use, the wider the aperture, the more light is let into the camera. The narrower the f-stop, or the narrower the aperture, the less light that's going to hit the camera. Now, as well as controlling the amount of light that is let through to the camera, the f-stop can also give us that nice blurred background which we all like in our cat shots. So by using a wider aperture, as well as letting in more light, we're also blurring out more of the image that isn't in focus. You may be wondering, when would I use a narrower aperture, to say f9 or above? This comes into its own when doing landscape photography. So if you're on the bank and you quite like getting those nice rod shots, but you want to see other things in focus as well, such as the trees or the lake behind or even the sky, then you may like to shoot in f9 or above. So it's really worth having a play about with the apertures to get those nice shots. If you like the more arty, blurred out bokeh shots, then you might want to use a wide aperture, like I said, an f2, f2.8, something around those. If you like to have things in focus, then you might want to use a narrower aperture such as an f9 or above. Now that moves us on to our last setting, which is shutter speed. Now as the name suggests, this is how quick a shutter closes. So a quick shutter speed is something of around, say, 1,000th of a second. Obviously it shuts that quick, 1,000th of a second. This means less light is getting into the camera, so you may have to compensate by bumping the ISO up or using a wider aperture. This is how the three affect each other. If you're using a slower shutter speed, such as a second or 2 seconds or above, then you're going to let more light into the camera because it takes longer for that shutter to close. So you may be wondering, what shutter speed should I use for my cat shots? I tend to play it safe and do something like 250th of a second. It shuts quick enough to capture that moment without causing any motion blur, but it also doesn't affect my other settings too much. Now, if you're taking a cat shot on a really bright sunny day, you may want to bump that shutter speed up, so you may want to take it at 500th of a second or even quicker. On the flip side, if it's say a cloudy day or you're shooting more into darkness, you may want a slightly slower shutter speed, so you may want to drop that down a bit. But be careful not to drop it too low, because then you can cause motion blur, which is not what we want for this type of shot. So I'm going slightly off topic, but slower shutter speeds are good for things like long exposures. So when you see those nice rod shots where the water looks really still or there's almost like a haze on the water, that's when people are using slower shutter speeds to get that effect. Now that's a very brief look at camera settings. You can go far more in depth than that, but that's the basics in a nutshell. Now you may be wondering what the ultimate cat shot settings are, and that really does depend on the situation. As a starting point, I would definitely recommend having an aperture of around 2.5. Now you can go lower or higher depending on what you prefer and what the situation is. But just remember that you'll have to adjust your ISO and your shutter speed accordingly. So that's a quick look at the settings that I use when taking cat shots and that I feel work best for myself. But like I said, have an experiment and see what works for you. What we'll actually do now is go in the garden and set up the camera and tripod as if we're taking a self-take. and we'll also show you how to use that intervalometer. So the first thing to do is position the mat where you feel like the best light source is and where you're going to get the best shot. Now once we've chosen that spot where we think we're going to get the best results, we're then going to put our tripod and camera down. Now we're going to roughly frame the shot, and we might need to move the camera and tripod about until we've got that perfect. And once we have done, we're going to dial in the settings as a rough estimate. What I'm then going to do is pop my intervalometer into the side of the camera, and with that in the camera, I'm then going to set that to take a photo every 4 seconds. Now what this does is gives the camera enough time to take the photo and store all that information on the memory card before it takes another photo. Now for my catch shots, I tend to use autofocus, and what I do for this is I actually set the box for the autofocus just above the bottom third. This is usually where I'm holding the fish, and it focuses perfectly every time. This will vary from person to person where you're used to holding the fish, but what you can actually do is dial in that focus manually. Now the way to do this is once your camera is on the tripod and you're framed that perfectly, what you'll then do is take the camera off of the tripod, walk round to the mat, hold the camera out where you'll be holding your fish, punch into the tripod head and focus on that. That will give you that perfect distance between the tripod head and the fish. So when you now attach your camera back onto the tripod head, you'll have that perfect focus punched in. The reason I use autofocus and don't do this is purely for a timing point of view. This takes a little bit longer to do, so use whatever out of those works the best for yourself. Now all that's left to do is to fire up the intervalometer with the push of a button, and that will mean your camera is now firing off shots every 4 seconds or whatever you've actually put into the intervalometer. All that's left to do now is to get the fish out of the water and begin photographing. Once both sides of the fish are photographed, now is the time to treat the fish for any wounds on the flanks or in the mouth. The reason we don't do this before the photos is if you're using something like propolis, it tends to drip down on the fish, and you don't really want that in your photos. So long as you're treating the fish, doesn't matter whether you're doing it before or after your shots. You can now return the fish by setting your camera up before you get the fish out of the water. This means that the fish is out for the shortest time possible, which is ideal for the fish, and also you've got some really nice shots. Now that wraps up a very basic tutorial for self-takes and camera settings. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions at all, please feel free to drop me a message on Instagram and I'll do my best to get back to you. But in the meantime, subscribe to our YouTube channel and make sure you stay safe.